Good morning, everybody. We are getting used to technology. I think if you look at us, we're all a bit of an older generation. So this is a wonderful new adventure for all of us. Welcome to this for Future Africa, our second transdisciplinary dialogue. And today we're really privileged to have one of the people that I really admire the most, which is Roderick Lawrence. And we have a running joke here at work that they think I'm in love with you, Roderick, because I have never worked with somebody so absolutely professional. It is a pleasure, and it was a pleasure, and I hope it will be a pleasure in the future. So welcome to Roderick, and welcome to Coleen, who likewise has been my mentor and my beacon of light in transdisciplinarity in South Africa for many years. We've known each other for a long time. We've worked together for a long time. I just would like to quickly give you a little bit background on Roderick's CV, his very short bio. He's well experienced in this field. And he was in the beginning nominated a professor in the Faculty of Economic and Social Sciences at the University of Geneva in 1999. That was just after we became a democratic place. He was promoted to honorary professor in October 2015. He was visiting professor at the Institute for Global Health at the United Nations University from 2014 to 2016. He was the founding director of the Certificate for Advanced Studies in Sustainable Development at the University of Geneva from 2003 till 2016, and director of the Global Environmental Policy Program from 2010 until 2016. He was a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Swiss Academy of Arts and Sciences Network for Inter- and Transdisciplinary Research between 2009 to 2020. And then best of all, he's the author of Creating Built Environments, Bridging Knowledge and Practice Divides, and then the most wonderful Handbook of Transdisciplinarity, Global Perspectives. And you will see there's a special offer to everybody at this stage of a 50% discount for this book. And I really, really would like to promote the book, not just because of the wonderful content, and it's really useful, but also the excellent, how can you call it? Just the way it's presented. It's just perfectly edited. I find such a pleasure to look at it and to read these well-edited contributions. So Roderick, on that note, and with a congratulations to you on that handbook of yours, I'm going to hand over to you and Coleen to have a discussion and enlighten us about the global perspectives of transdisciplinarity.
Thank you. Thank you, Hester. Can you all hear me? I hope you can. Can I go ahead? Hester, can you hear me? Right. Thank you all. We've had a few glitches, as you've heard, about getting connected, but here we are. Thank you all very much for this chance to be part of this wonderful dialogue. You've heard that Roderick has had a very long history in terms of working from traditional science and then branching into what might be called more of the transdisciplinary science, the boundary kind of spanning roles that he's played. So it's a wonderful privilege to be able to start this conversation. Transdisciplinarity is becoming very in vogue in some areas, but also opening up a lot of questions that we need to still ask. And we've heard, for example, that many of us in South Africa are struggling with huge challenges, energy, et cetera, So what kind of science do we need? What kind of science would be appropriate? So I'm going to start the first question and say, welcome, Roderick. You look much warmer than we are here in South Africa with our rains in the Western Cape deluging us and freezing in Johannesburg. So we wish we were as warm as you. But what I'd like you to reflect on is a little bit as a segue from your CV, is how you came into this field, a little bit of your background, if you could take us through that. Thanks, Roderick.
Well, thank you, Coleen, and thank you, Hester, for your very generous remarks. And it's a privilege to be able to share some of my ideas with you and the audience today. And to come to this first question that Coleen has posed, I was an undergraduate in architecture and town planning at the University of Adelaide when I first was tempted to challenge what I was being taught in undergraduate education and what I was seeing in practice, because architecture and urban planning is one of these interesting disciplines where it's both a discipline and a profession. So we're talking about theoretical knowledge, conceptual frameworks on the one hand, but we're talking about knowledge in practice on the other hand. And that's something that architecture shares with law, with engineering, with medicine. And it's something that I think really set the stage for my whole career, because my career has been based on how do we use knowledge in practice. And as Hester said, that was the title of my book, Creating Built Environments, and trying to bridge the gap between knowledge and practice. So from my point of view, of course, the knowledge you need depends on what you want to achieve. What is the purpose of becoming an architect or a lawyer or a doctor? And in my case, it was really much focused on housing and residential environments. And it was a concern not just about the physical fabric of the house and the local community, but how the house can become a home, how the housing environment can nurture social relations and all those kinds of questions. And so it was before I finished my undergraduate training that I realized that I could not get that knowledge from within the discipline of architecture or town planning. And so my first step across the disciplinary border was with psychology. And what could psychology help me in understanding this complex relation between people and their housing environment that was, to me, the fundamental question at that time. And that's where we had the beginning of a discipline called architectural psychology. And it became environmental psychology today, which is more widely known. So that was my first step towards an interdisciplinary approach. That is, how do architects and psychologists, or how does architectural knowledge and psychological knowledge combine to provide us a better understanding of the housing environment? And of course, I was then fortunate to take up a research scholarship at the University of Cambridge. And so architecture and psychology became supplemented by anthropology. And I was absolutely fascinated by the way anthropologists could go out and listen to people in very different places, try and understand their perspective on their habitat and their local housing environment. And so my concern became not just one about the individual resident and the housing environment, but about the cultural perspective of housing. And I took up this concept of the cultural predispositions that help us understand why housing in Geneva is different from what it is in Pretoria or London or Zurich. So I was really quite interested in this interdisciplinary perspective. And when you then look at what the social sciences were suggesting, they were treating the residents as subjects of study. They used questionnaires, much like the psychologists as well. they use questions as that to try and understand the point of view of the individual as a subject of study to better understand this relationship between people and buildings. And so to me, that was interesting, but it raised lots of questions about the context in which housing is built, which we've just mentioned, about the diversity of opinions. How do you accommodate them in the housing environment? And that's where I had the fortune of moving to the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne, where the resident no longer became a subject for research, but he was an active participant in the housing process. And we was using modeling techniques that were unique at that time, not just in Switzerland, but some other European countries, about using modeling techniques to simulate future housing environments. And the residents were in the room doing that with the architects, with the researchers. So they became active participants. And I think that's where my engagement with transdisciplinarity really began. So we're talking about the 1980s. We're talking about the shift from conventional social science research about the housing environment to the active involvement of residents in creating their housing environment. And from there, I then realized that that raised lots of questions about the role of research, the engagement of professional practitioners and researchers with the people that they're planning housing for, and also the position regarding questions of the rights of the resident to express him or herself about their needs and how we accommodate the diversity of needs. It's no longer just the expert that decides. So in many ways, I feel that my path towards transdisciplinarity is quite different from that in the natural sciences, the physical sciences, and indeed even the social sciences, because it comes back to this question about how do we know what is best to be used to create or change something in the world in which we live. And I then became involved in teaching inter and transdisciplinary research. I became involved in the Swiss network, as Hester mentioned. I attended my first transdisciplinary conference at ETH Zurich in February 2000. And since then, I don't think I've ever looked back. I've never looked for another different pathway. I've tried to deal with the challenges that this path involves. And I think that there's still much work to be done, and I'm going to continue walking along that pathway for as long as I can. Thank you.
Gosh, thanks, Roderick. Amazing types of approaches that you've brought through. I wonder, though, if you could expand a little bit more with your book and also from your experiences about, one, the purpose of science, but number two, the various modes of how we do this transdisciplinary work. You know, you have the Zurich kind of school, the work of Helga Novotny and others, and then you also have the Nikoleskin approach. And I wondered if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that, because I think for many scholars and for some in the field, many of people stop at inter and intradisciplinarity and not in the transdisciplinarity. So I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit more globally on the academic background and scholarship in this field, and whether you think it's currently, you know, fit for purpose. Are we just doing dialogues with people and interviews with people and, you know, that kind of thing, and suggesting that we're ticking the box, we're doing practice, but in actual fact, we're still driven by, you know, our agendas, our kind of focus, and not really engaging in hearing what the practitioners really say. So I hope that's a little bit clear. So if you could maybe comment on that, the nature of the science of transdisciplinarity that you've seen evolve over time. Thank you.
Well, that's a very interesting and important question, because today there is still a lot of confusion about inter and transdisciplinarity, and you can still find publications in 2024 that treat them as synonyms. However, I've suggested that they're completely different, and the handbook that we're referring to today clearly shows that they are different. And this difference was extremely well explained by the International Council for Science in a position paper last year about transdisciplinarity and the way forward. And the reason for that is, I'm mentioning that is because this position paper, for the first time by an academic group, highlights the differences between inter and transdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity, just briefly, is the collaboration between disciplines. We're talking about disciplines intentionally collaborating with each other. So if I go back to my example, architecture and psychology would be collaborating together. Architectural, psychology, anthropology, but each of these disciplines respects their definitions, their concepts, their methods, and their protocols. And they're willing to exchange them and perhaps combine them in ways that are extremely interesting. And in fact, interdisciplinarity has been very beneficial. I mean, one of the most interesting concepts in my field is one of called place identity, which is growing from the collaboration between architecture, psychology, sociology, geography, and it's actually used now in practice when we're talking about redefining certain urban neighborhoods. We talk about, are we going to change the identity of the local residents? And so these are fundamentally important questions. However, coming back to your question, so interdisciplinarity is different from transdisciplinary. That's a fundamental takeover. And the reason it's different is because it's not just using disciplinary knowledge, concepts, methods. It's using other types of knowledge and professional know-how, which are considered to be just as equally important and pertinent as scientific knowledge defined by disciplinary research protocols. And you've got the wonderful case in Africa of indigenous knowledge, for example. It's fundamentally important. But you've also got the knowledge and the know-how. Think of the knowledge and the know-how of all those people living in informal settlements. It's something that is lived, it's experiential knowledge, it's personal knowledge, it's certainly not scientific knowledge, and it was never meant to be. But that doesn't mean it's not important and shouldn't be taken on board. And I think this is one of the key obstacles for transdisciplinarity to become mainstream, because it's really questioning the pertinence and the credibility of scientific knowledge to deal with societal challenges, like how do we improve the quality of life and health in informal settlements. Science alone is not going to help us solve that problem. We have to bring in these other kinds of knowledge and know. But beyond that, we have to bring in the people that are making the decisions about the living conditions in these informal settlements. So it's a political agenda as well. It's an ethical agenda, a moral agenda. And many of these issues were included in science, but they were never focused as or prioritized. And so transdisciplinarity is really challenging conventional, scientific, discipline-based research that proposes to solve societal issues such as climate change, such as health and quality of life in informal settlements, such as migration flows, but will not be able to do that if it doesn't transgress the boundaries of conventional research agendas and bring in these other actors in the institutions who are fundamentally important in defining the way we live today. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, so thanks, Roderick. So you've raised a number of even more complex, wicked arenas for many of us who work in this field, because the traditional ways of doing science, the traditional processes in the universities, especially for younger scholars, you know, the ethics processes that we have to go through, et cetera, are quite often not up to speed, if you like, for some of these kinds of approaches that you're mentioning. So I wondered if you could, because there are issues of power inequalities, you know, when you go into these areas, whose agenda is really uppermost? Is it still being driven by scientists? And although it's cloaked in a transdisciplinary kind of framing, it isn't really respecting, you know, indigenous knowledge or local and tacit knowledge, et cetera. So I wondered if you could walk us through a couple of examples from, maybe taken from your book, where you think you did it, you know, really well. And then maybe we can turn to where you think it didn't work so well and what are remaining challenges in this field. And I think it's really for those of us who are trying to bring through the next generation, you know, what are some of the risks in a way of going into the space? So if you could give us a couple of examples of your success stories, and then maybe we can shift to some of the obstacles that still remain. Thanks, Rod.
Well, yes, I think there are many success stories which I've included in my book and included in the handbook, thanks to the contributions of the authors of the 35 chapters. One finds, let's start with housing. Where the most innovative and creative solutions to housing occur, they are not based on conventional academic research about the housing environment. And they're often not based about government-provided programs for housing provision. They're coming neither from the public or the private sector. They're certainly not coming from the conventional construction center, but they're coming from what I would call as a third sector, and that is the community-based collective housing approach, which has existed in Europe for 100 years now, and which is growing in importance in some countries such as Sweden and Norway. And one finds that these are community-based projects. They're not academically led. They're not led by private construction companies. And we find examples now in Switzerland as well. And I've included an example in chapter 4 of my book about a cooperative housing project in Zurich, which has bypassed the public and the private sectors, and which has been able to provide housing, not just for people in the local community, but there was a collective decision to provide housing for immigrants who would have been homeless. So these are very, very interesting proposals in the housing area. Another area where one sees very interesting innovative projects, which is not provided again by the agro-industrial food sector, it's healthy food for local communities. And this means questioning the whole international agenda about access to healthy food based on food security. And I've challenged that concept and said we need a concept like food sovereignty, so that it's the local community deciding what they grow to eat, rather than some agro-industrial company at the national or the international level suggesting what people should eat. And one finds examples around the world of urban-based agriculture, local community gardening, which is providing food for people that before did not have access to healthy vegetables and fruits. And so these two examples, we could go on with others, but I think they show quite clearly that there's much to be done. And these examples are recorded in the handbook and in my Creating Built Environments book as well. Now, what that really is suggesting is that, again, who decides? As I said before, the local community, I think, are the way forward for transdisciplinary, innovative projects, because I don't think that there's any way other than involving the local community and giving them the voice before we move forward and get a social adhesion from the group to take this to meaningful solutions to current societal challenges.
Thanks, Roderick. But I wondered if we could just push it a little bit further, because those of us who are working in these spaces in South Africa, you know, we have many municipalities, policy arenas that are changing sometimes rapidly, almost regularly. The ways in which this kind of science finds traction into policy. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, not to reify, you know, policy in any way, but I get your point about really focusing on communities, honoring with humility our role as scientists in those understandings of what's going on. But in terms of getting traction and starting to be, you use the word transgressive, I wondered if you could reflect back on any example that you had and perhaps pull out what was it that made it go the extra mile a little bit further in terms of some of the traction that we need to shift a lot of the things that we need to now shift. I think many of us are aware of some of these structural constraints that we have in our society. So is there a study that you either yourself did or in your book or you know of where we have been able to ramp up and take something forward sustainably? Thanks.
That's really interesting question, because it comes back to your question of science and the purpose of science. And I think science is there for the public good. I don't think science is there just to answer some kind of individual curiosity. It certainly shouldn't be there just to make our peer reviewers content. We've got a broader societal impact, which we can come on to later, about the societal impact of science. And that's a fundamental issue in a post-truth world. So if we haven't got the facts, I mean, there's a lot of, especially in architecture and urban, evidence-based policies for housing and the built environment, for example. And we find the same in many other fields, increasingly so in our post-truth world. But facts are always interpreted by individuals. So there's always a value system behind the way we're interpreting the facts. And if the perfect example of that was the coronavirus pandemic and the diverse ways that coronavirus was interpreted by local governments, national governments, and especially according to political allegiances. I mean, the differences were incredibly important, but the data was there. We knew how many people were dying in cities, in countries, at the global level. But I mean, there were still the skeptics. There were still, you know, these people that were challenging science. So I think science needs to reposition itself. And to come back specifically to your question, I think one way of doing that, based on my own research, and it was research in an EU 7th framework program about access to public green space in cities and their impacts on health and quality of life. And I think there are no simple solutions to these very, very complex questions that we're talking about, but we need to not just look at the numbers, we need to look at what we call the co-benefits. So that if we are taking the example of providing more green canopy in cities like Pretoria or Johannesburg. We can talk about reducing atmospheric pollution. We can talk about increasing shade cover, perhaps reducing the heat island effect. And therefore, there can be impacts on health and quality of life. So this is really important, because when we're talking about increasing the green canopy, the public parks in cities, of course, there's the first question comes up: who pays? And so, of course, it's not just a question of money. These co-benefits, for example, investing in the green canopy of a city or a neighborhood can have health impacts. That is shown empirically. And so we are reducing expenditure on health. We're not just increasing cost on landscape architecture and maintaining the tree canopy in cities. And this is the way we need to think. This is the way that this concept of co-benefit needs to be used more frequently, because we're beyond the scope of talking about either or. That's just simplified reductionism that doesn't deal with the multiple dimensions of the kinds of complex problems that we're dealing with in the 21st century. I don't know if that's answered your question.
Okay. I want to keep pushing a little bit, because those of us who are working in these spaces are often frustrated. It takes a lot of time. It's all relational. You need a lot of trust building in these spaces when you go in. And so one of the critiques that I get from people when I talk about transdisciplinarity is they say, oh, that's applied science. That's not real science. Because, you know, you've got you don't have a really strong hypothesis. You're working with communities. You're trying to find their inputs. It sounds a little bit like you're doing some consultancy. And so, again, I wanted to ask, and it's a debate that we have in my group where I work at WITS. Many people say the funders are driving this agenda quite strongly. Many funders are now putting in, it must have some element of transdisciplinarity. But there's no scope in the funding process to design an agenda that is really co-beneficial to both parties and is actually being co-designed. So when do we follow an academic agenda, which then you go into a community with a predefined, you've got a question that you're trying to answer, versus, or in addition, is you go into the community and you ask from scratch, what are their matters of concern? And you build up from there into your science. So it's again this kind of challenge that we're having between the traditional way of doing science, the traditional way in which we get funding for limited periods of time, et cetera, and then this notion of emergence, that things must, either bubble up from the bottom or be a mix from the top and the bottom, et cetera. And again, I just wondered if you could give us some insights from anything that you found that might help us, those of us particularly working in the global south with some very south kinds of questions. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. That is an important question, because there are a lot of people who do not want to take the pathway I took towards transdisciplinarity, and they're using the kinds of arguments that you mentioned. Oh, it will take so much longer. It will be so much more difficult to publish, so I won't get my peer review, and therefore I'm going to have a problem with promotion and career path and so forth. That wasn't my case, but it is a common argument that is used. But I think we need to come back to your fundamental question at the beginning of this second part, and what is the purpose of science?
Exactly.
And is it for the public good or not? And we need to position ourselves. And I position myself saying, yes, it had to be for the public good. It had to be a human-centered approach. And so I was really supported subsequently by that wonderful article of Rittel and Weber from 1973. And everyone quotes it because they say they introduced wicked problems, but in fact it was churchmen who introduced wicked problems before them. But what they did say was that scientific problems are not the same as societal challenges. They made a fundamental distinction there, and they said, as I mentioned before in this dialogue, that science alone cannot solve societal challenges. We have to bring in these other kinds of knowledge and know. We're not saying that science is irrelevant, but we're saying it needs to be complemented because it's not enough. And I don't think that argument has been made clearly enough, or those of the skeptics that talk to you haven't read that article. And I mean, we're talking about an article that was published 50 years ago. So I think that article still stands today. And that's where people since then have taken this movement called post-normal science. They're saying that there is another form of science, which is not based on the conventional discipline-based concepts, methods, protocols. It is a science for the public good. And if we're serving society, we need to involve them in defining and framing the problem before we understand it better, and then suggest that it could be resolved. Now, what's also interesting is that Rittel and Weber said you're not going to solve societal challenges, you're going to resolve them. But because they think of the case of coronavirus, the risk is still there. We haven't solved the problem. We resolved a pandemic, but we don't know what's coming up next. And so these are the kinds of issues that can put a completely different perspective on science. So I would say, let your friends continue in their academic institutions with their, what Rittel and Weber called tame science, and let's get on and do some science for the public good.
Okay, thanks. We've got two questions in the question and answer. And the question is coming from younger academics who are already, climbing in their pathways into professorial positions or whatever. And if you take these routes, you may be challenged and you may struggle to climb up the so-called academic ladder if that's the only thing that is being recognized, which I think most people are starting to shift now. But I just wondered, the colleagues on the question and answer are asking, how did you navigate this? Were there challenges in initiating this kind of research from your position space as an academic? And then we'll come back and see if there's a follow-on. And then I want to just go to one last question before we open it up to everybody. So, Roderick, there does seem to be this, people are taking your ideas. This is not the only type of science we need. Obviously, most science, hopefully, is with the common good in mind. This is in particular for sustainability challenges, possibly, mainly that our focus needs to be. But what are some of the career impediments, and how would you suggest we navigate around those? Thanks.
That's a really important question. And it really depends on where you are in the hierarchy. Let's not forget that academia is very hierarchical. And I was fortunate enough to have people above me, like the dean, who was quite open to inter and transdisciplinary approaches, and wanted them not just in the research, but in the teaching. Whereas he was coming from the social and economic sciences, the natural sciences, scientists involved in the Master of Environmental Sciences were quite skeptical about the importance of inter and transdisciplinary approaches to teaching at the master's level. But we did it. And it was one of my achievements. And what was so important after the first 5 years, we had external people coming in and evaluating the program. And believe it or not, they said, well, it would be so good if there would be more inter and transdisciplinary approaches introduced into your master's course. And so the skeptics were quietened, at least for a little while. And then what became even a stronger driver was that when students were applying for the master's course, they had to have a letter of motivation. And they generally said that the reason they wanted to do this master's course, because it was specifically inter and transdisciplinary in nature. And that, I think there is a movement among the younger generations to look at these, first of all, complex questions, not just discipline-based approaches, but looking at the complex questions from this broader perspective beyond the borders of specific disciplines. And so it is a challenge. I admit it is a challenge. If there are opportunities, just take them, I would say.
Okay, good. So coming back, turning back to one of the questions I asked about the science that we develop using such approaches, and then how does it get scaled? How does it go out into trying to really into the implementation space, which everyone is now working on? And the issue that often comes back is that the evidence, do you have enough cases to really make the science evidence-based claim that this is something that people should really take seriously, whatever the topic has been investigated. So it comes to this kind of monitoring and evaluation and, and learning. Many of us are into those spaces, and reflection about what we do. So MERL, not just monitoring and evaluation. And again, it's the slowness, I think, with the problems of the funders and the universities to see the value add. But by the same token, there's a huge responsibility on us as scientists to be writing and publishing in really good, credible journals, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit from your book and what you've seen. Are there compendia or cohorts now of robust, I use the word, cases that we could bring together and start to really, through the different councils of science and activities, where we elevate this kind of science much more? What are your thoughts on the monitoring, evaluation, and what we've learned? And then I'll open it up, I think, through the, if we can, get some questions from people who are on the line. Thanks, Roderick.
Well, I think the handbook, Coleen, was really meant to present 35 chapters where you see advances in teaching and project implementation from many countries around the world in different perspectives. And these kinds of commendum and handbook are extremely important and much needed, because let's be quite clear, inter and transdisciplinary research is still not mainstream. That most of the funding is going to discipline-based research. And so that's why I referred to the position paper of the International Council for Science. This was perhaps the first time that an association of academic institutions and funding bodies has actually endorsed inter and transdisciplinarity. Before, it was OECD, it was those kinds of organizations that do not necessarily have an academic mandate, but they are there to say, this is really important to solve societal problems. Now, whether you're doing discipline-based research or inter or transdisciplinary research, the question remains about monitoring, evaluation of outcomes, because I think in general, academics are very, very poor in monitoring and evaluating what they do across, all of those domains. It's not just something which is particular to inter and transdisciplinary research. So the question to me is, yes, that is a fundamental question, but does transdisciplinarity make a difference? I think that's the kind of question we need to know, given that it takes longer, that funders are not necessarily giving us the money to have the dialogue processes that we want. And so it's really important to come back to this. And I think there are some interesting developments, such as the Declaration of Research Assessment by DORA, which is an association in San Francisco, which is talking about criteria, relevance, credibility, just and fair research, and its applicability. All coming back to this question of what is the purpose of achieving what we are actually doing? What is the purpose of publishing in peer-reviewed journals, which have very little societal impact? Is it just for our career development, or is it for something else? And these are fundamental moral and ethical questions. And so I think I come back to this point. I think there are a lot of very interesting projects that are now documented in the handbook or in my book and in many other publications, including peer-reviewed journal articles. But we need to shift from the project level to a general level of what I would call a social movement of science for the public good, which is enacted by transdisciplinary inquiry. And I just wanted to follow on that. I'm suggesting that transdisciplinarity is not just research. It's not just research written. I've said it can be community-based. And I think when you get into this reflexivity, the dialogue process and so forth, we need to rethink that transdisciplinarity needs to shift from interdisciplinary research to transdisciplinary inquiry for all the reasons that we've been talking about this morning.
Wow. So quite a task, and let's hope we're all up to it, including all the communities. And, you know, we use the word community quite generally for the common good, if you like. I wondered if we could now, Hester, would you like to come in with a question possibly? And then if the organizers can enable us to see if we can get some questions, if anybody, I've tried to bring them in the discussion that we're having, but I wondered, Hester, would you like to come in? You can unmute yourself and ask Roderick a question, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you. Anybody want to come in? Hester, are you wanting to come in at all? Nothing. Is there anybody, let's just see, there is a question, for example, in the chat from someone called Egmont Roa to everyone. He speaks about his interest in chemistry, education and the survival of many languages under threat. The challenges obviously are manifold and truly transdisciplinarity. We thought smart villages would be a wonderful theme for future Africa at UP. And then his question is, do you have any views on engaging academics for such a dream? It is difficult to address them in their disciplines, be they in the humanities or the natural sciences. So that you can also apparently give a question by raising your hand, but I unfortunately cannot see that. So the organizers will have to alert me to that. But I think if you can type into the chat or into the questions, so perhaps to Egmont, again, it comes to some of these blockages, that the challenges to getting a group of people to help you move some of these debates and approaches in your university setting. I know you've discussed this already with us, but if you can give us a last nugget. Thanks.
Well, I think, yeah, we're talking about a social movement in academia, if we want to change academia. And having said that, I don't think, from my position, academia is not necessarily the main driver of transdisciplinarity. It is the one where all the publications are happening. But when you look at the housing projects that I've mentioned, the urban agriculture and local food markets that I've talked about, I mean, these are not driven by academia. So they might need academics to help them monitor, to assess, for example, soil quality in the local community garden or whatever. And this is happening. But the question that was raised here is really talking about the position of academia in society, and that is something that's been discussed for a long time, but there's been very little shift. We're talking again, not about mainstream, we're talking about, you know, trickling down effects, I would say. And academia is, let's face it, ultra conservative and very difficult to change because of the discipline-based nature in which universities are founded and managed and administered and funded. And so I think some of the most interesting, innovative projects are coming from outside of academia, being funded by OECD, being funded by UNESCO or other endowment funds, for example, and we can learn a lot from them. And perhaps academics need to learn more from them.
Okay, we're coming to the end. Yes, sorry,
Coleen, I really apologize. I was pressing buttons. I disappeared from my screen for a while. Thank you very much for all these comments. I just want to say that we're not alone in this process of promoting transdisciplinarity. And one of our allies that I think is very valuable is the Open Science Networks, the Open Science Endeavor, where knowledge is not being protected as much as it used to be, and it's not behind a paywall and those kind of restrictions. So we need to make friends in a much more broader sense, not just with the communities, but with the whole internet world that I still battle with this morning. But it's very valuable for us in working in TD. And then I just also want to say it's very important from my point of view, in the context of this discussion, to build strong teams that people are caring about each other, that are being careful in what they do and considerate in what they do. And that's normally for me the key. You can have one bad apple in the bunch and your project really flounders. And then I just want to say that Roderick, you've made such a lot of references to the International Science Council position paper, which I've circulated as much as I can, but I think it's really one of the very insightful documents. And we will have our next dialogue with the authors of this International Science Council report to talk about the future of transdisciplinarity, because a lot of the recommendations there is institutional recommendations. And a lot of our questions today is focused on the institutional support that we need and require for TD. So we hope to follow up on this discussion with something that is much more logical than just suddenly becoming a new topic. And then the importance of IKS, we will also flag for a future discussion. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, it looks like we've only got 3 minutes left. So I'll hand it back to Roderick, your parting shot, if you like, and then I'll thank everybody and we'll see how we can take this forward with future discussions. Thanks. Over to you.
I just wanted to say that people have obviously been involved in Q&A and chat, and I haven't had the time to follow all of that, unfortunately. I'm not from that younger generation of wizards in communication technology, but if any participant would like to pose a question or follow up, you can contact me by email at the University of Geneva, and I'll do my best to answer you. And I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me to this dialogue, and I look forward to future collaboration with all of you. Have a great day for the remainder of this day, and thank you, Coleen, for chairing so well.
Thank you all very, very much. You've given us lots of food for thought, and let's just carry on, as they say, onwards and upwards. And I look forward to also being part of some of these discussions and debates going forward. So thank you, everybody, and thank you in particular to Future Africa and to the University of Pretoria for enabling this interesting discussion. Thanks, everybody. Keep warm if you're in South Africa, and keep cool and calm if you're in Europe. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.